Hey, so picking back up, I think I was talking about sort of those reactive responses that can be present in PTSD. And so we're talking about exaggerated startle, hypervigilant, can be sleep disturbances related to recalling the event. Um, let's see, problems with concentration, irritability and angry outbursts. PTSD was previously called shell shock because it was thought that it was only in combat military members, so military members who saw combat, but we now know that's not the case. Um, but that shell shock, that unofficial term or unofficial diagnosis it encompassed the the emotional side of PTSD, the reactive or hypervigilant side of PTSD, the dissociative side of PTSD, so sort of detaching from life and feelings and loved ones, and then of course the mood changes, the changes in mood associated with it. Um, what else do I want you to know about this? What constitutes a traumatic event, of course, can be combat related. That's typically what we associate with PTSD. Experiencing a storm, experiencing a hurricane, experiencing a tornado. Um, think about all these sort of very scary things when you think about it as an adult, and then think about it as a child. How might that be perceived very differently? Of course, being the victim of sexual assault, rape, um, being violently injured, purposefully or not, car accidents, anything where there's imminent threat to your life or to your loved one's life. Trying to think of kidnapping, hostage, sexual trafficking, of course, incarceration. Um, um, think of what it says that I haven't covered here. It says in here that the violence doesn't have to be, the sexual violence doesn't have to have happened. It can just be threat of sexual violence. It can be threat of physical attack. So you don't have to have been raped to have PTSD. You can almost be raped. I think considering what's going on in the news right now, that might be a timely example. So anyway, so remembering that, these are big traumatic events. These are big traumatic events, and PTSD is going to come into play when at least a month has passed, and looks very different for children and looks than it looks for adults. There's some treatments for PTSD that are interesting. So EMDR has been widely used for processing those traumatic events. So being able to, first of all, you'd have to be in the right sort of stage in your therapy to go to that place, because it is re-experiencing and reliving these events. So EMDR, exposure therapy. So depending upon what the traumatic event may have entailed, exposure therapy may be relevant. What else? Assessments are really important in determining the diagnosis, of course. There's cognitive behavioral therapy that is specifically focused on trauma, and that may be helpful if behavioral therapies are in line with what your theoretical orientation is. And then, of course, they're so interesting. Trauma-centered and trauma-sensitive yoga is listed in your text, and I think that's really important. So tapping into that stress relief or anxiety relieving exercise, but in a way that is mindful of your traumatic experience. And so with trauma-informed yoga, there's no hands-on manipulation of the individual in those classes. So the yoga instructor is not manipulating the individual to do these moves. There's a softer sound, so it's not really loud. Yoga is not typically loud anyway, but there's just more mostly it's touching. Yoga instructors are careful to not touch and to offer alternatives when certain positions are maybe more reminiscent of, let's say, a sexual assault or an attack. There's an alternative position that is offered if it starts to get to a point of retriggering. And then medication, there's not one medication for PTSD symptoms. SSRIs can be used, and so there's some medication that can address some of the mood issues and concerns, or even some of the more startle responses or behaviors. Let's see. So interesting to note about PTSD, there are some interesting federally funded experiments, or not experiments, I guess they are actually, some federally funded research that's going on with the use of psychedelics in PTSD. That's been happening for quite some time, but there's sort of an interesting resurgence in the literature and research. So, allowing hallucinogens or allowing individuals to take hallucinogens to access those traumatic events without them being actually as traumatic as they would be without the sort of buffer of the hallucinogen, the ability to disassociate as a result of the hallucinogen. It's thought to allow the individual to access those memories and process them in a way that feels safer. So LSD, ayahuasca, psilocybin, to name a few. What else do I want to let you know about PTSD? The risk factors, what's an interesting risk factor to developing or potentially developing PTSD would be the presence of other mental health issues or traumatic events prior to the event. So what we're seeing is that when individuals are a bit more vulnerable and then they are exposed to, and I mean vulnerable emotionally, psychologically, and then they're exposed to a traumatic event, the likelihood of developing PTSD symptomatology is greater. That's an interesting thing for us to know, because think about individuals entering into the military. They get this litany of a workup, and now we are including not just a physical workup, but also a psychological workup. That doesn't necessarily mean in times of war that that's all that important in times of war, especially if you consider sort of times of draft. I don't know how much psychological workup they did then, but now we know a little different, that the more vulnerable an individual is, the more likely they are to develop PTSD symptomatology or any other mental health diagnosis, to be quite frank. There are some environmental factors. So how long were they exposed to this event, or in what level of severity? Your book, I think, refers to it, or the DSM refers to it as the dose. Refers to it as the severity of the trauma or the dose of the trauma. Did they experience it? Did they witness it? Whether they experienced or witnessed it, it might look a little different. Doesn't mean they won't develop PTSD one way or the other, but that it might look a little different. And then, of course, continued or repeated exposure to something that's traumatizing. So an individual, we'll just use combat-related PTSD again. So an individual who experience a traumatic event in war, and then they come home and they go back and experience another traumatic event. If you know anyone who's in the military, oftentimes people sort of may sign up for those bits of duty multiple times and go overseas and experience even more traumatic events repeatedly. Again, there's quite a few differential diagnoses. So there's a lot of things that you need to rule out before assigning a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. So when we look at acute stress disorder, this is the diagnosis given if the event was 3 days to 1 month from when you've seen them. I'm not going to go too much into acute stress disorder other than be mindful of that time frame. So it's a really short time frame for the individual to be processing that traumatic event. If it goes beyond the month, we're looking at a different diagnosis. When we look at prognosis, individuals who get help sooner rather than later tend to do a little bit better. That doesn't mean that everyone's ready to receive that help that soon after a traumatic event, but it could increase their prognosis. So mindful of that, mindful of what your client, what clients are ready for. It's never appropriate for us to sort of, here's an example, you just experienced a rape 2 days ago, you need to immediately sort of address it and start working through it. They could get some help, but doesn't necessarily mean it needs to be processing that event fully in that moment. I think, with trauma and traumatic events, it's important to sort of, regardless of your theoretical orientation, really sort of follow the lead of the client. If your client isn't ready to address it or go to certain aspects of this event or processing the event, we do more damage by making them go there or sort of re-traumatizing them or re-triggering them, or re-exposing them to the event that is so upsetting and traumatizing for them, causing them these behaviors, these symptoms of behaviors or the symptomatology associated with PTSD. Okay, and so going on, the sort of last thing that I want to talk about is adjustment disorder, and I want to talk about that because it is a disorder, and it's a real disorder, and it is sort of the emotional or behavioral symptoms associated with an identifiable event or an identifiable stressor. And that's vague. We'll just say it's vague. It's vague. And because it's vague, oftentimes if you have to bill to insurance and you don't want to give a diagnosis, this is what's used. Adjustment disorder is used. Or if symptoms don't necessarily nicely or neatly fit into a disorder, adjustment disorder is a diagnosis to give. It can encompass quite a few things. And if you go through your DSM, you can kind of see. But it can be one stressor, it can be multiple stressors. But this is a diagnosis that's often used and is billable. So if you don't really know what the diagnosis could be or should be, or you don't have enough information, adjustment disorder may fit the bill. And they're pretty common. Oftentimes, I've heard people argue that we all sort of have adjustment disorder at various times in our life, or could fit the criteria for adjustment disorder at various times in our lives. Making sure that you're ruling out any actual disorder that the symptoms your client's displaying actually meet the criteria for. Let's make sure we're being ethical and we are in fact giving them a diagnosis that meets their symptomatology. Comorbidity with adjustment disorder, making sure that we're ruling out any sort of medical disorders, that we're ruling out anything that needs to be really specifically ruled out. Sorry, I got a little distracted as I was talking. I want to make sure I touch on this. What's interesting about trauma and stressor-related disorders is that all of these have a pretty high instance. There's a high propensity or high instance for suicidality. So we need to be mindful of where the individual is and how they're processing these stressors and how they're processing the traumatic events that they're exposed to or have been exposed to, because suicidality is pretty prevalent and high in these disorders. And then, unspecified trauma and other specified trauma, be mindful of using those diagnoses. Again, insurance companies are getting weary of billing or paying for unspecified trauma. And then other specified trauma, you'd have to really sort of be clear on why you're giving that diagnosis as to one of the other diagnoses that maybe your client can fit into. Let me know if you have any questions about this, and sorry for it being super lengthy.